Hey, what's going on, everyone? Sebastian here with Spin Driving School, and today's video is going to be a little bit different, a lot different. So I got this request. I actually have gotten this request multiple times to essentially give advice on what your first vehicle to purchase or maybe to lease should be. So that's that. We're just gonna get right into it. I'll probably post some links underneath the video related to this topic regarding, maybe dealerships and places I've been to. And also, please keep in mind that this video is going to be based, on my knowledge, but at the end of the day, my previous experiences and the good and the bad and the pros and cons, essentially these are just my opinions. So even though it's an advice, but take it with a grain of salt, because at the end of the day, these things are very subjective. They're just opinions. So let's go. So what your first car should be. At the end of the day, it boils down to what is your budget, okay? Because if you have a lot of money, or if you have enough money, or if you have a certain, lifestyle in mind, then essentially boils down to that. If it's a budget car, then what you want to be looking at is, I would say, the mileage and the year of the car, and also its previous owners and experiences, right? So the wear and tear on the car, as I said, the mileage, has it been in any accidents, etc., etc. So if you look at it from that standpoint, going to a dealership might be a safer option. However, you'll be paying more, and then you'll be paying for paperwork. A lot of people don't know that there's a lot of hidden fees when you go buy cars from dealerships. Sometimes you can get away with not paying all the paper fees, but add anywhere from $700 to $1,000 on top of the asking price, unless you can talk them down, depending on the dealership. It might work in your favor, but at the end of the day, going to a dealership is not always going to be the best case scenario. There are other options like, ads, even Craigslist, Auto Trader. Don't be afraid to buy cars or anything from Craigslist at the end of the day. Yeah, there's a lot of scams and a lot of fakes, but there's a lot of good deals. I've purchased 2 cars off of Craigslist in the past, and both of my experiences were totally fine. In some cases, you can pay cash, so you're not paying taxes, quote unquote. Private sales, things like that. You can go to these smaller dealerships where the overhead is not going to be that crazy, so you can maybe get a better price, a better deal. Also go to multiple places, right? Do some research online. Again, compare prices to Auto Trader, even Kijiji or Craigslist, or I forget what the other ones are, but anyways, there are multiple places online where you can check out car prices and whatnot. So at the end of the day, it boils down to the budget and where you want to, or the source where you want to get the car from. So there are pros and cons when it comes to dealerships and private sales. And then you have, honesty of whomever you're buying the vehicle from. So just because you're buying a car from a dealership doesn't always mean that they are going to be honest. I've been in situations myself, and I've heard of people, family members, close friends, where they've purchased cars from dealerships, and we're talking about prestigious or well-renowned or well-respected, well-reviewed dealerships, and sometimes, you buy a dud. They're just not being honest, because at the end of the day, people want to make money and they want to get rid of these cars and push them off the lots, right? So the salesman will go through a lot of hoops and hurdles to sell you whatever it is that they're selling you, okay? Now, they still have to confirm with the managers, and there's a process to it, but at the end of the day, it may not be as smooth, as pleasant, and as financially smart, let's say, to do so. However, as I said, it really depends on the budget. So if you don't care, then that's, I guess, I would go with that option, right? The other option is also leasing, especially when it comes to insurance prices right now. I've had students who found it that it was easier for them to lease a brand new car and, you know, pay whatever $300-400 insurance a month, because that's how much some people pay. Some people pay more, again, depending on the car. So I'm not going to get into that right now. But for some people, the option would be better or more, or makes more sense, maybe not even always financially, because it will be a little bit expensive if you lease in a car. But sometimes the dealerships will, you know, also do the insurance for you. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. And that could be an option. But again, depending on your budget and how much money you're willing to spend. You know, and you can buy a car for $5,000 and it could be a decent car with decent mileage from a neighbor or from a friend. I've had those happen, right? And again, you can buy a car from a dealership that it's going to be maybe not a piece of crap, but it might break down the line, or again, there might be some other issues like leaks and etc. etc. I've had those happen as well. So you just got to do your research. Maybe take the car to a mechanic or a trusted source so they can have a look at it before you purchase it. You shouldn't have to do that if you're buying a car from a dealership, because you think they are going to be honest, but that's not always the case. And also, you know, make sure that you look at the accident records, right? Check out the Carfax. And the whole rebuild thing, that's probably another question that a lot of people are wondering about, rather. The rebuild status is very tricky because, as far as I know, and I may be wrong, because I don't work for ICBC, even though I used to work in a car repair shop, so I do have some of the knowledge from there. But the short of it is that rebuild generally starts over $1,000, right? So anything under $1,000 is not going to be claimed as a rebuild. Anything over $1,000, or might be a little bit more, might be considered a rebuild. So now, if we're talking about just a bumper job or a fender or something really small and minor, especially if it included a paint job, you know, those prices can get really high, especially nowadays. So you might have a rebuild status and the car is pretty much in a tip-top shape. I mean, you shouldn't really care. You shouldn't really care that much about body damage unless it's really extensive and expensive. But at the end of the day, what you're looking for is, you know, engine, frame issues, extensive or extreme body issues, because that may result in leaks and things like that, right? Broken windows and windshields and replacements, and depending on who's done it. So again, check out Carfax. Most dealerships, if you buy a car from a dealership, they will usually present the record of the vehicle. So that's another thing to look for. But don't be turned off just because it's a rebuild. Look at the history of the vehicle and see how much, you know, what was done to it, right? If it's been in multiple accidents and it has a lot of issues, a lot of problems, then maybe not. And sometimes you won't know these facts, especially if you're doing a private sale. So that's another downside of doing or buying a car privately, or not through a dealership, right? Or from someone who may not be honest, because they may not be disclosing all that information. So this is why it's very tricky. And in the beginning of this video, I said this is somewhat of an advice, but these are my experiences, and you know, you might get a second, third, or fourth opinion, because it's always worth it. Okay, don't just listen to what I'm saying. Take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. So another thing to look at is, if you're looking at the rebuild status, which is sort of important, is were the parts replaced or were they fixed? So if you have parts replaced, then again, not a problem, because they're brand new parts, doors, bumpers, etc., etc. When they were fixed, depending who fixed it and the quality of the work, right? Especially if there were a lot of holes or patches or dents, etc., etc. In most cases, nowadays, parts are usually replaced, especially the more intricate parts, especially parts with airbags. So like doors, a lot of times are replaced, and they're not always. In some cases, they can be fixed, and that's where you can get leaks if someone didn't fix it properly. Even though when it's going to be painted over, you won't be able to tell. But if you take it to a specialist, they can tell you parts that were fixed and painted if they're not being disclosed on paper. So that is another thing to look at. Who did the work, the quality of the work, new parts versus replaced parts versus was it just a fix? Was it just a patch? So there you go, another thing to look for. Now, as far as marks or makes of cars, we're gonna start with the basic, let's say, right? Toyota Corolla, Mazda, Honda, or any Toyota, I would say, depending on your budget. Any Japanese car you buy is pretty much going to be a win, especially Toyotas. I mean, there's a reason why driving school cars usually are Toyotas. It's not because they're cheap. Toyota Corollas or Toyotas in general are actually, they can be more, especially now, they can be more expensive than even, you know, Mazdas or Hondas or other marks, depending on the trim and the model and those things. But the reason why Toyota Corollas are so popular is because they are reliable. They're pretty easy to fix and to maintain and pretty cheap to maintain, right? So if you buy in a car, that's another thing you want to look at is the maintenance of the vehicle. If you buy a high-end European car, for sure, you're going to run into issues possibly down the road, you know, with maintenance, even oil changes. I mean, I know people that pay, you know, $200 for an oil change because they have a really expensive high-end car. So that's another thing that you have to look at. Changing lights and light bulbs. You know, in my car, it's pretty easy. You just pop a light bulb in and you're good to go. In some cars, you have to change entire panels. So again, if you get into an accident or if you have to fix something or just your regular maintenance like oil changes, tires, etc., those things can get a little bit expensive if you have a car, you know, that's a flashy car or an import. It tends to be more on the expensive side. So like a high-end vehicle, right? BMW, Audi, a lot of the German, European cars are kind of known for that, have more expensive maintenance in general. And they also don't last as long, and they do tend to break down faster and sooner than Japanese cars, let's say. At least that's my experience. This is why I would say Japanese cars are more reliable. I mean, one thing I learned, you know, this is going back 20, 25 years, is anytime I drive on the road, on the highway, if I see cars that are broken down on the side of the road, and I'm not talking about like flat tires and things like that, that's different. Now, cars who just, you know, basically die on the road. Very rarely you will see Japanese cars and Toyotas. Usually it'll be American cars or European cars. So, you know, I would avoid those two. American cars can be a little bit cheaper, especially nowadays. You know, they're not as bad as they used to be, Chevys and Fords, but I've owned very few American cars. I'm not a big fan, never was. You know, a lot of mechanics and people I've talked to and had experiences with, they were always speaking very highly of Japanese cars. And European cars too, but I would say European cars are really good when they're brand new or newish. If you're gonna buy a used car with a lot of mileage, depending where you're buying it from and what the source is, I would still recommend, personally, I would recommend a Japanese car. So Honda, Mazda, or a Toyota. Now you can get into some Korean vehicles too. Kias, Hyundais, they are not bad. Definitely not bad. You can get good deals and good quality vehicles, especially nowadays, because those cars been, you know, they've been on the market for a while. So a lot of the kinks and things that issues that they used to have been ironed out and worked out. So there's nothing wrong with Korean cars, but I would say Japanese, for me personally, would be the number one option. Okay, so I'll be looking at that. Next thing, mileage, the wear and tear on the car, who you buying it from, you know, is it a smoker, a non-smoker, is it a teenager or an old lady, right? Because a teenager, a 17 or 18, 20-year-old guy, fella, could be a lady, is going to be driving probably a little bit more aggressively than an older gentleman or a lady. Thus, the vehicle is going to be, you know, more wear and tear, more mileage, possibly more accidents, right? So you want to be looking at things like that as well. And I'm not saying that American cars are, you know, crap, because I do love old American cars, you know, 60s, 70s, 50s, even some of the 80s. I mean, a lot of the newer cars, especially trucks, American trucks are maybe not superior to Japanese ones, especially Toyota Tacomas and, you know, that range of vehicles is is something special. Then you have the European range and Land Rovers. That's a different field, right? And those cars are going to be a little bit more expensive. So, you know, I'm not trying to turn you off, the viewer or the new buyer, from American cars. At the end of the day, like I said, it'll probably boil down to the budget. Make sure that you pay attention to the mileage, the year of the car as well, but sometimes people get really hung up on the year of the car, but they don't think about the mileage, right? So if you're gonna buy an older car with less mileage versus a newer car with more mileage, that could be a better option, right? Could be even cheaper. Not always, because a lot of pricing does take mileage into consideration. This is why a lot of times you will see older cars of the same model, but they'll be more expensive because they have less mileage. You know, could have also to do with other things, you know, just a cleaner status and not a rebuild, because the pricing does come into play if it's rebuild versus non-rebuild status, unfortunately. But like I said, it doesn't really have a huge effect on the longevity of the car as long as it has not been in any extensive damaging circumstances, situations, accidents, etc., etc. I've mentioned that before, but just bringing it back one more time. So that's that would be my quote-unquote advice, and these are my past experiences. So Japanese cars, can't lose, especially if you can get one with low mileage or, you know, decent mileage. I would say under 100,000 kilometers if you find a car. I mean, depending again on the budget, but that's a good deal. Now, as far as prices, they can vary. You know, you can buy a car for $500, at least you used to be able to, and it could work for a year or a couple of months, and then it's not going to work anymore. So sometimes you get what you pay for, and it's just how it is, folks. So I hope that helps, and I know this video was a little bit different, but by request, we'll see you in the next one very shortly.